Hello, and welcome everyone to this plenary session of the Prince Nahido Awards Conference 2021. It's lovely to have you all with us. My name is Kelly Lee, and I'm grateful to be speaking to you from Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada, which is situated on the unceded territory of the traditional Coast Salish peoples. Our session today is entitled Politics, Political Economy, and History, Major Trends Shaping the COVID-19 Pandemic. I want to give my thanks to the session coordinators, Jesse Bump, Ronald Labonte, Robert Yates, Dennis Carroll, and Naoko Yamamoto for bringing us all together. The background to this plenary session is how this pandemic has unfolded in such an inequitable way within and across societies worldwide. While not unpredictable, it has still been striking how people have been impacted so differently along many different social stratifications by location, race and ethnicity, sex and gender, socioeconomic status, employment type, and so on. These inequities have been caused directly by the coronavirus, resulting in different patterns of morbidity and mortality, but also indirectly by social conditions and the policy responses to the pandemic or lack thereof. Limited data might be cited as a hindrance to addressing these inequities. After all, we cannot fix what we don't actually count. And there are certainly knowledge gaps that need urgent attention. However, a plea of ignorance is hardly convincing. Inequities began to appear from day one of this pandemic and has worsened with each passing day. And perhaps most concerning of all, it's been also predictable. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived at a moment of historic income inequality in the world. It arrived at a time of rising populist nationalism and wavering support for multilateralism. And it arrived at a time when the world economy is dominated by global capitalism and transnational corporations. And indeed, as well as being layered on top of these structural fault lines, how these very fault lines have contributed to the emergence and spread of the coronavirus worldwide also needs interrogating. It's been said that we've entered an age of pandemics. So how did we reach this point, and what do we need to do to change this trajectory? So it's in this context that we are having this conversation today together. And as the world's attention is understandably focused on the present, as we struggle through this global pandemic, and as we begin turning our attention to the future, how do we recover and become more resilient as we go forward? It's absolutely critical that we learn from the recent past. What does history tell us? What can we learn from the past few decades that will enable us to shape a healthier future for all? So with this very brief introduction, this is how our session will be organized. We have three eminent speakers who have been allocated 5 minutes each to speak. It's a short amount of time for such a big topic. So each of you will have to be highly efficient with your words. I will let you know, or the organizers will let you know when you have a minute left, and I'll try to keep you to time because I really want to hear from our audience. Each of you out there, we have 30 minutes on question and answers. So I'm going to rely on our global audience out in Zoom land to send us questions so that the speakers can respond to them. You can also vote for questions if you want them answered. So I'll do my best to get to those questions and to get our speakers to respond to as many questions as possible. And you may also participate in the chat box, and I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya is the director of the Center for Global Health Histories, professor in the history of medicine, and head of the WHO Collaborating Center for Global Health Histories at the University of York in the UK. His brief presentation is entitled Colonial and Imperial Extraction, Internationalism, and the Western-Centric Dominance of Global Health Governance. Welcome, Professor Bhattacharya.
So my presentation today is based on a global health histories perspective. That is an approach based on defined methods. This allows me, these methods allow me a systematic analysis of mainly unpublished evidence, not just based on the study of reports, published reports, which I believe are politically negotiated documents, or biographical narratives, or memory as history, which focuses on the relatively few and the memories of the relatively few, nor is global health histories a focus on institutional histories, which focuses on roles played by specific organizations and some external collaborations and collaborators. But global health histories, the approach I'm using today, is based on daily, weekly, monthly, unpublished reports from all levels of global health governance, where one sees multiple views, multiple agencies, multiple actions, and multiple results. So having presented you with a very succinct idea of what my methodology today is, as I describe trends to you, let me present you with two worldviews, okay, that continue, I believe, to endure in global health. So one is a top-down view, where a relatively small group of people tend to think their ideas are the best and want to present these for implementation all over the world, globally. They also usually tend to believe that their ideas are the best. There's hardly any peer review involved because such decision-making happens behind closed doors mainly. And then these ideas or beliefs held by relatively few people become the basis of best practice for research and policy work. And in these narratives, when you look at unpublished material, you will often find reference, for example, to a view like, let's identify a person or a couple of persons, our friends X, in that low and middle income country who can give us quote unquote local knowledge so that we can also demonstrate our racial and national inclusiveness. Now, to these very ideas, you have a different set of reactions on the ground. What we often see is a view that these are interesting offerings, but largely decontextualized. There is no space to understand in these sort of ideas about what is different within each country and within subnational groups and administrations within them. Then, often, when you look at unpublished memos from the ground, there's a constant questioning about how such protocols can be imposed if we are to win political and administrative buy-in. Global health doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to buy and win political and administrative and social support. And that requires thought and very specific action. And in relation to point 3, the view from the ground is, how can this English-speaking elite big city actor understand complex local needs, mainly in rural areas, and mobilize alliances? But there are other differences I want to highlight to you as well today. And these are enduring extractions or processes of extraction that continue to this day, I believe. So from the top-down civilizational view, and I use the word civilizational in a considered way, the view usually is, blimey, this low and middle country context is so much more complex than I'd initially thought. Then the view is, let's redesign best practice protocols to quietly accommodate crucial ideas from localities, diverse locales. Then progress. Now let's write an evaluation, history. All evaluations are history, remember, which then justify the next step or what is done next, arguing that our original plans guided the entire successful process. And then finally, let's move on to quote unquote lead another funded project. So what then happens on the ground? From the ground, the questions are different. The question I often see, when will these chaps actually step out of the air-conditioned cars and actually spend meaningful time on the ground with us? Or we will adapt this policy to local socioeconomic and political needs to ensure intersectoral stakeholding happens, and they make it happen. And then, as progress is being organized and a history is being organized, a sort of backslapping history is being organized by the top-down civilizational few, the question then is, on the ground, why are our contributions not mentioned in the reports that lead to follow-up grants and journal articles, and that only seem to embellish high-income country CVs of people we hardly saw? Then, of course, the final piece from to the jigsaw on the ground is these high-income country colleagues cannot be trusted. So for me, this kind of history and such
quickly sum up, Dr. Bhattacharya, please.
Yeah. So for me, such views, therefore, raise these following questions. I leave this here for you to look at. But the point is that those who communicate in non-European language are not intellectually constrained. They do have agency, and not listening to them, especially in a pandemic like the one we face now, means that we miss a lot of crucial lessons in community engagement and COVID control. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, our second speaker, is Professor Ronald Labonte, he's Distinguished Research Chair in Globalization and Health Equity and Professor in the School of Public Health and Epidemiology, University of Ottawa in Canada. For the past 25 years, Dr. Labonte has focused on health equity impacts of diverse globalization processes. And the title of his brief talk concerns the rise of neoliberal orthodoxy, the competitive state as a response to capitalist crises. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. So I've been tasked to give us a bit of a different kind of glance back to our recent past. And so put simply, the pandemic, as we know, illustrates and magnifies what has gone seriously wrong with our past 40 years of neoliberal economics and global market integration that's dominated the policy landscapes of most governments. From structural adjustments to financial liberalization to austerity measures following government bailouts of the global financial crisis, the prevailing belief was that open markets, small governments, low taxation, free capital mobility, and rationally choosing sovereign individuals would, in time, ensure prosperity for all. It has not. Rather, and until the pandemic began absorbing almost all of our attention, the world was confronting three interrelated existential crises: surging inequalities in wealth, accelerating climate change, and the mass movements of people within their own borders and from poorer to richer countries, largely in response to the other two crises. Now, the pandemic has muted somewhat neoliberalism's cheerleading, and governments once more find themselves in the economic driver's seat, with high-income countries spending so far around $13 trillion to keep their domestic economies afloat. This is something most low and middle income countries cannot afford, just as they now find themselves outbid in a race for vaccine nationalism that exposes the frailty of our multilateral commitments to global health security. We hear repeatedly now how the pandemic is merely shining a light on those crises that preceded it. So let me briefly consider each of those. First, our past 40 years did see a dramatic decline in poverty, at least when it's measured at the extreme $1.90 a day level. But poverty rates at what's considered an ethical cutoff, around $7 a day, increased in many of the world's regions, even as wealth inequalities rose to unprecedented heights. As we also know, extreme poverty and extreme wealth have both risen during the pandemic. Even as economies contract, stock markets boom, creating even more wealth for the world's 1%. A legacy of underregulated financial markets and low interest rates, creating a world awash in capital, engaging in even more arcane forms of speculative investment. And if we think that austerity has been thrown into the trash bin of failed ideas, we need to think again. Fiscal contraction is still very much a part of most IMF pandemic loans packages. Now, second, it's also true that our past 40 years have seen dramatically improved health globally. But as the Commission on Planetary Health 5 years ago cautioned, this is simply because, and I'm quoting, we have simply been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize gains in the present. Climate change is only the most pressing of the many ecological boundaries our growth-obsessed economy is pushing us towards. We have unsustainable high levels of consumption by the wealthier and healthier amongst us, which contributes directly to the greater disease burden of an under-consuming poorer population that is least responsible for our environmental mess. Are we surprised then that so many people are trying to move to safer, cleaner places? Now, these are huge but not insurmountable crises, but they demand a radical break from any pre-pandemic normal that nostalgia may have us wanting. To begin, governments need to re-regulate finance and to retool global trade policy to put health equity and environmental sustainability ahead of economic growth as their rules-based metrics. It also means an end to 40 years of global tax competition. Instead, governments need to increase substantially progressive tax measures across all sources. There's an abundance of disequalizing untaxed wealth floating around the world that desperately needs crisis-level harvesting for the public good. With respect to our environmental comments, the post-pandemic growth mantra needs to be green, of course, but it needs to be much more. Most green growth strategies are about substituting fossil fuel energy with other sources. Now that's important, but it does nothing about our overconsumption of rare earth minerals or of water, land, and ocean resources, or of biodiversity loss. Nor does a nationally focused green growth agenda deal with the unsustainably skewed inequities in global resource consumption. So we need to have a serious talk about a degrowth agenda, one in which the unnecessary overconsumption of a wealthy minority is placed on a strict and gradually reducing diet that allows the underconsumption of the poor majority to rise, all within the renewable limits of the planet's ecosystem. Now, moving forward with policy choices in this direction will not be easy. It will require a radical multilateralism previously unimagined, and it has been the task of the PMAC webinars and the plenaries that follow to begin contributing to that imagining process. Thank you.
Third and final speaker is Dr. Mariangela Batista Calval Simão, Assistant Director General to Access to Medicines and Health Products at WHO. And prior to joining WHO in 2017, she worked with UNAIDS and the Ministry of Health in Brazil as the Director of the Department of STDs, HIV/AIDS, and viral hepatitis. Dr. Simão's brief talk is entitled WHO's Increasingly Vocal Stance Against Vaccine Nationalism.
Now, let me say first a disclosure that I'm not an academic. So I've been, in my entire life, I'm a medical doctor by training, a pediatrician, and most of my professional life was in the government as a policymaker, and later on now in the past years in the UN. And obviously, we all know that we live in a world where fairness is an abstract concept. Right? And the world, as we knew, has changed in many ways. And I think there were good things that we have seen during this, we are seeing last year and still beginning of this year, like, for example, the speed of the R&D for health products that will help us, hopefully, to end the acute phase of this pandemic. We've seen also unprecedented collaboration between, for example, Big Pharma collaborating with pharma in developing world, biologicals, vaccines, and so on. We had never seen that at this extent that we're seeing now. But also what Professor Labonte was mentioning, we see at the same time that there is an attack on multilateralism, but there is also this global collaboration in this environment where there is an increased feeling, sensation, and increased action towards collaborations that, like the ACT-A, the Accelerating for a technology access pool for COVID technologies, right? Where you have a large range of international global health players working with WHO to make sure that we bring together not only the R&D, but thinking of the end-to-end process, and that at the end of the day, it only matters the research and development or the innovation if the people actually have access to them. So, and we see from the market perspective, we see something that we had never seen. You know, when we began, especially on the vaccines, I'm talking about the vaccines, we saw, you know, we had these issues on high-income countries and low and middle income countries, right? There's always this divide. I've been working with access to health products for many, many years in my life. But this is the time when you actually have high income countries, rich countries with no manufacturing capacity, and low income countries with good manufacturing capacity for vaccines, for example. So we see in high income countries with small markets having no say and totally lost in this context of having to buy or having to face constraints because they actually cannot produce products. And this brought also the need to diversify the supply chain, right? It's highly concentrated nowadays. But just going back, I'm sorry, because there's a lot to say in 5 minutes, but it's very clear in this pandemic that crises like this one, they just make what was bad worse, right? It was already mentioned the issues around increased inequalities. It's not only among countries, but also inside countries. And we also are seeing right now, we're going through an acute phase of inequities in health, the access to services and access to products. And inequities, and here, this is very close to my heart as well, and I always like to cite Sir Michael Marmot, because he framed it really well, saying that inequities in health are preventable, right? So this is it, they are preventable. And what are we seeing right now in the world? We are seeing that 59 countries have started to roll out vaccines, and Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO, is speaking very frankly about the danger of vaccinactionalism, that we can't end this epidemic country by country. We need it to end it globally, right? There is no end to this epidemic until it has ended everywhere. And we see that out of these 59 countries who have started vaccinating, 75% of the doses have been deployed in only 10 countries. So we had two phases for this pandemic. Also citing my boss, the DG, he says it's the world's faced with a catastrophic moral failure if we fail to address the vaccine inequity, access to vaccines, but we also fail in the terms of the economic catastrophe, because it's not only because of the virus that's causing havoc everywhere, but it's also derived by the inequalities. And you may know that we had a new study commissioned by the International Chamber of Commerce Research Foundation that found that vaccinationalism could cost the global economy up to $9.2 trillion US dollars. And almost half of it, 4.5, would be incurred in the wealthiest economies. So for the past 4 months, 9 months actually, 9 to 10 months, WHO has been working very closely with the other partners on the COVAX in the COVAX facility, because we have learned from the past pandemics, like H1N1 and HIV, about the lag between the time when rich countries access a global good and the time that this reaches developing countries. In HIV, it was more than 10 years, right? In H1N1, it was around 7 or 8 months. And what we have done, and I'm saying this is because it's also a solution that it's global collaboration, the COVAX facility, which now is comprised of 190 countries. We will have a lag of around 3 months between the bilateral agreements have been dealing with vaccines being deployed in some countries before the vaccines reach these 190 countries, and they include upper middle income countries, some high income countries who have not started vaccination, and low and middle income countries. WHO now has 4 vaccines besides the Pfizer vaccine, which was already emergency use listed, has another 4 vaccines in advanced stage of assessment. 2 of them will provide to the COVAX facility, and we are expecting to start rolling out the vaccines in countries in late February or early March. And I think the question, yes, not just a question for us, because history is going to judge what we are doing right now, right? And what would the world look like if we don't put in place this multilateral, these efforts, initiatives that bring all countries together and that give them the opportunity to access safe and effective vaccines. I'll end here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry to rush all 3 of you. It's an impossible feat to talk about these really important fundamental issues in 5 minutes. So you've been given an impossible task, but thank you for that. It's a very sobering thought that how will history judge us? It's I hope better than we're doing at the moment. So we have a number of questions actually come in. So this is the point where we're going to let the audience ask questions. I'll try to get as many as possible. If the speakers could be relatively brief, we have about 20 minutes to answer questions. So the first question actually comes from one of the conference organizers, the session organizers, Professor Jesse Bump. And he asks, the 3 speakers all identify broad historical patterns of inequality that underpin major problems in the COVID era. All of them point to the need for governance reform, which many have invoked in advocating for the decolonization of global health. How can we move towards rectifying the unfair extraction of the past and addressing the power inequalities of the present? For example, in limiting vaccine nationalism, redistributing resources, paying reparations, and democratizing global health governance, for example, or focusing on social and commercial determinants instead of only diseases. That's quite a long question, Jesse. That's probably 5 minutes in itself. So let me call on Sanjoy. Do you want to? I'll let you guys volunteer. How's that? Because it puts you on the spot. Otherwise, I can see all 3 of you.
I can start.
Anyone want to jump in, Sanjoy?
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on, how we see global health governance. So when we look at WHO, or we talk about the WHO and look at the headquarters, then yes, a lot of what you're saying is true. But then when I look at the regional offices, and I am one of those people who sees the regional offices as a result of being a result of decolonization. So the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office and the Southeast Asia Regional Office were actually set up as an act of decolonization to make sure that the WHO was not like the League of Nations health section, which was dominated by imperial powers. The second thing to always remember, and some of my WHO colleagues often forget this, that colonialism didn't end formally after the Second World War. European empires continued in Africa and other parts of the world. So we also have to focus on the anti-colonial struggles that enriched the WHO and left a mark on the WHO. So I suppose many of the solutions actually exist because we have had generations of anti-colonial fighters leaving a mark on WHO debates and discussions. The problem we have right now is that those voices are erased, and the voices of the ex-colonizers tend to get most airtime. And there is no critical self-reflection of this history at the present moment, which really creates difficulties. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for those. And maybe we start now. We start being more critically reflective because of this session. I'm going to actually go on. There's a number of questions. That's why I want to get to those. There's a question for you, Ron, from Fran Baum. Hi, Fran. How will we win political will for the progressive taxation measures Ron Labonte advocated for? And there's a lot of support for those. But so how do we get the politicians on our side?
Well, let's sort of see. Thanks, Fran. You asked the simple questions, the ones that we've been asking for about 200 or 300 years of living with different kinds of oppressive regimes, kind of globally, internationally, etc. Scream and shout, protest, try to engage with politicians. I think we need to find a few political leaders, and I think it's probably going to come more from the middle income countries, countries like Aotearoa, New Zealand, like Australia, Canada, the Nordic nations. Create a like-minded group of countries. Maybe France will join, and basically sort of say, we've had it. We need to have massive kind of tax increases. There is just so much private wealth that has grown so incrementally huge just in the last 10 years that remains untaxed. So the first starting point there has to be within countries, but then at a global scale, systems of progressive taxation. I can think of no other way in which we can have a redistribution of at least income resources. The ecological resource question is much bigger, and that's why I said that we need to have a serious conversation about degrowth, which is an unfortunate term in some respects, but really basically says we cannot have the material resource throughputs that we presently have at the consumption levels we have if we hope to have a planet that will be able to support human life. But also going back to the anonymous or Jesse's initial comment, there's a starting place for us. And I think that when he talked about vaccine nationalism, why aren't wealthy countries and some of the middle income countries, why is there opposition to the developing country initiative to create a waiver, a TRIPS waiver, on all medical supplies, diagnostics, vaccines, and technical knowledge that would release the capacity of all those vaccine manufacturing facilities that are predominantly in low income countries and put them to use to at first overcome the supply side issue of vaccines. The rollout issue is a bit more complicated, but if we can't do that, all we're doing is we're stepping back into kind of like an almost bigger than our neighbor hyper nationalism that unfortunately led us previously to 2 world wars. Over.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. And please, whoever, if you'd like to add to this conversation and that response, please put your comments in the chat. There's lots of things going on there, but great response. I think it's doable. It sounds very doable, but we need to get organized. The next question comes from Philip Kerrigan. Thank you, Philip. Well, I'm going to ask Dr. Smale to respond to this one. What does history teach us about the best strategies for bringing together high-income country researchers and policymakers with local on-the-ground communities and agents in a meaningful, honest, and mutually constructive engagement as possible? You've worked as a practitioner, as a policymaker, and in communities. You're probably the perfect person to answer this.
Maybe not, but I can try, because it's an excellent question. I think we are seeing a lot of that in this pandemic, from previous experiences we had in the past. And I think HIV was a good experience where we brought researchers and the communities, and the community voice on demand creation became very strong. I think it's the only other one that I can remember where we managed to bring together the different constituencies and advocate for equitable access, which was the mainstay of the HIV pandemic, right? The access to medicine. Now, what we are seeing in this time is that there's this global research community that's working around the different areas on COVID. It's maybe because of the virtual space, there's much more interaction, actually. Like last week or the week before, WHO did a discussion on variants with the global research community, and it had almost 3,000 participants. For what would be in normal times, like 100 people, we managed to reach out and bring 3,000 participants. So there are ways that this pandemic is helping us a little bit with this, with bringing community. The other point is that it's not helping on the misinformation, right? Because it's much easier right now through the communities as well to spread misinformation. But if you allow me just 1 minute to address something that Professor Labonte mentioned on the TRIPS waiver, Because this is the whether is intellectual property a barrier right now or it's not a barrier. That's a big issue that the world is trying to grapple with. Because intellectual property was never seen on the vaccine barriers, but it plays a role, right? It plays a role in WHO at the request of Costa Rica and with 40 countries has launched what we call the CTAP, the Technology Access Pool, through COVID Technology Access Pool, where we have two sides. We have one with the sharing technologies, sharing information, sharing databases, and so on. And the other side is a voluntary licensing mechanism to make sure that we set the ground, not only for this pandemic, because we have manufacturing issues now with the vaccine, but we have traditionally manufacturing issues, for example, with biotherapeutics like monoclonal antibodies. Right? And we're saying that we think set the ground now. It doesn't help in the acute phase because technology transfer takes a little bit of time, and IP, a compulsory license, also takes a little bit of time. But it sets or voluntary license, it sets the ground for us to tackle with products for which there's very high prices and very limited manufacturing capacity in the world. So I tackle two questions.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to Dr. Bhattacharya, because this was your topic, the original question about, how do we meaningfully, we'll go back to the vaccine issue in a minute, because that's eliciting a lot of questions. Could you say a little bit more about how do you meaningfully engage, in community level?
So, I think global solidarity is a very important thing, but I also believe that the term global is not self-explanatory. To make meaningful engagement possible, it needs to be a racially inclusive term that acknowledges power imbalances and consciously works to break down those power imbalances. So equity in discussions, equity in research, where people from low and middle income countries, negotiators, researchers from low and middle income countries are not seen as people who ultimately will be given a gift, but people who will be part of a very complex process of global research and implementation. I think unless we start with that starting point, I can't see meaningful, equitable relations develop, because whatever terminology we end up using, however nice it may sound, my sense is a lot of what we are seeing today is just plain old colonial politics. And I find that unacceptable. So if we have to break the mold, we have to create, I think going back to Professor Baum's question, a new global order, a new way of doing things, where globalism is defined in positive ways and not in exclusionary ways. I don't know if that makes sense.
It certainly does, and I think a lot of us are on the same page. A lot of people are saying on the questions that this is quite normative. This, with equity, and this is what we're aspiring to. And I think people are looking for practical things, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So there's a number of questions here I wanted to get to about that. Let me just. So Stefan Nachuk says, this is really important. Certainly, we all agree that, but it feels a bit normative. Given the nature of COVID, there seems to be a notion that rich countries are not engaging more deeply on COVID relief will ultimately come back to bite them. Why not introduce some realpolitik into this as well? And we also have a question, a comment from Dr. Bikram's Jenna. Thank you, Dr. Jenna. What is the important policy to take for immediate relief from pandemic crises? If history is important, what can we learn from the Spanish flu, for example, how policy threatens third world countries' politics and development? So people are saying, I think they're in the immediate. So does anybody want to respond to that? Ron, did you have any comments about that?
If I kind of understood exactly what realpolitik was meaning in this particular context, yes, but I'm going to just assume that high-income countries are not paying attention to the fact that ultimately, of course, they're going to pay a price for not tackling something that is resolvable right now, which is really to deal with something as like a vaccine supply issue. If we go back to try to draw a lesson from the Spanish influenza, as our little preliminary video told us, the big problem is that governments weren't being transparent; they weren't telling the truth. And we've had that problem here now with the pandemic, and it's certainly in terms of looking at what issues are involved in terms of the vaccines. There's no transparency. We don't know what different governments are actually paying for access to the vaccines. We don't know what the cost of production versus the investment of public monies versus the profit margins are for the vaccine producers. We don't know why there is more of an attempt to try to have those patent holders contribute to CTAP. None of them have. I mean, so that we haven't had the transparency around the sharing. And I think that people, as we move into a delayed rollout of vaccines, which is going to affect high-income countries as well as, and especially low and middle-income countries, and most of all low-income countries, people are going to start to lose that civility in terms of wanting to comply with the public health regulations that are important. And the longer that we delay a rapid escalation of supply and access to vaccines, the more likely we're going to have more variants arise that are going to pose problems into the future. We're facing a catastrophic situation that isn't going away or not getting any better at this point in time. It just boggles my mind that so many of the world's governments are retreating into a kind of their own borders and sort of saying, we'll take care of ourselves first, then maybe we'll think about the rest of the world. That is not going to help. Over.
Thank you, Ron. Dr. Smile, you wanted to get in on this one?
No, I think what was raised is super important in terms of transparency, and there's an increased interest from member states in especially in pricing negotiations. Last year, the year before, we had this huge discussion at the World Health Assembly, and we approved a transparency resolution on markets and pricing, but we did not manage to go much, gain some terrain on the transparency on the R&D costs, right? So this is something that continues to be much of a black box on, but there's an increased interest because many countries cannot afford to pay the prices for some of these new technologies, and this includes rich countries. For example, even the US approved this resolution last time in 2019 because of the issues they were facing with high prices of medicine. So this is something quite important. More transparency on R&D costs is absolutely essential for us to build a new business model where we can talk about, not because companies today, many of these multinational companies, they are bound to how much profit that they can bring to their shareholders, right? And we are saying that we should discuss what constitutes a sustainable return on investment that would allow innovation to continue to be invested in innovation, but would end up in being on an affordable price for health systems to pay, and not for individuals. I'm talking about governments to pay for the medicine. So baby steps, but maybe we'll get there.
Baby steps, absolutely, but at least steps for sure. There's a couple of questions actually, and for you, Dr. Smile, about WHO. So people want to see WHO advocating, but recognize it's challenging. It's not the strongest player in the room oftentimes. But how can WHO advocate for example, equitable access to vaccines, but generally for change, broader change, when it's clearly we recognize, I guess we're speaking to the converted in some ways, but how do you do that?
No, I think there are many things that people don't know that WHO is doing right now. In one of them, we set the ground for how, once we had this COVAX facility organized, how will the allocation happen? That's a process that's led by WHO together with Gavi and CEPI. So we set up a mechanism where if we're going to have, like, let's say 50 million doses now in February available for February and March, or 70 million, we don't know yet how many will be. How will these doses be allocated to the 190 countries that are part of the COVAX facility? This is a way to ensure that there is equitable access. No, it's not perfect, because we have, in my previous speakers already said, we have a huge demand in a very limited supply, right now. But we are better than I expected we would be in January this year, because like 4 months ago, we didn't know if we were going to have any vaccine. And now from December onwards, we start to have the clinical trials finalizing. And now we have at least 4 vaccines that are very likely to be, 5 vaccines that are very likely will be pre-qualified, emergency use listed by WHO. We didn't know that 4 or 5 months ago. And then this allocation framework and this allocation mechanism is the way to ensure programmatically that countries will receive the doses that they need. A small country, or don't need to go knocking on each of these vaccine manufacturers' door to get their share. I think that's a very concrete, not normative, it's very concrete. Member states are being part of this discussion. We have X number of vaccines, how many doses will go to each country? There's an algorithm for that. And that's WHO working with partners. WHO is hosting this mechanism, and I'm actually coordinating it.
Thank you. Anybody else want to finally, we have a couple more minutes, and then we're probably going to have to wrap up. Ron and Sanjoy, did you want to add it to any of that? There's a lot of questions about the vaccine, about allocating the normative principles, but also the practical. Sanjoy?
So can I?
Yeah.
So, just taking a concrete example, how was smallpox eradicated? Hundreds of millions of doses of Soviet freeze-dried vaccine and American freeze-dried vaccine were handed out bilaterally, but equally, hundreds of millions of doses of these vaccines were given to WHO headquarters and regional offices for redistribution to countries that had sudden outbreaks. So it wasn't a question of one or the other. It was a question of multiple strengths working side by side, coming together to eradicate a very dangerous, horrific disease. If right now we only insist there's one way to distribute vaccines, what we are doing is supporting one political position, and that weakens all the other efforts. So why can't we today agree that there are multiple ways of distributing? The WHO has an incredibly important role to play, because the WHO is supposed to be apolitical. So if free doses of vaccines are given to WHO for redistribution to crisis areas, then the WHO can fulfill its democratic right. And in this, I'm afraid to say, the non-state actors have to keep their noses out, because it's the WHO officials who know where the crisis point is and how to properly, respectfully negotiate with member states.
Any final thoughts, Ron? We have a minute. Sorry.
Well, there was one question that I kind of responded to, and that is, the policy reforms, or the direction of policy reforms that I was suggesting, they're really big. They're huge. They're massive. But there is a lot of civil society, a lot of academic activism, a lot of political organizing or mobilizing on many of the different fronts that are implicit in those policy directions. And the obvious one to start from has to be taxation. And whether at a national or at a global scale, we can look at global systems of taxation. We have to look at initially at that kind of redistribution. But environmentally, we cannot be seduced simply by the fact that if we have economic growth, as long as we change the fuel source away from fossil fuels to something else, that's somehow going to deal with the fact that we're overshooting most of our environmental boundaries. That's something that is absolutely critical to take on board. And so that means that if we go into a post-pandemic environment, we have to do so with eyes wide open and with ears wide open and with a huge generosity of recognizing that the whole planet and everybody on it is now at risk.
Very much so. And I think this conference is very timely in getting us to think more deeply about all of these issues. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our very brief hour together. I think we've really touched on many issues, but we've also scratched the surface on what is undoubtedly a very large and complex topic. Nevertheless, I think this session is a great kickoff. It's provided much food for thought for the rest of the conference as it gets underway. So I think it's not possible to really summarize these sessions. I think there's so many wide-ranging important points. I think what's useful to take away from this hour is how we need to keep this big picture perspective at the forefront of our minds during this time. We've talked about specific things, but I think we also need to keep that broad picture in mind. Of course, the pandemic is being caused by a microbe, a virus that deserves all that, and we can get, throw everything at that virus. And we have endless gratitude to the people who are doing that, the biomedical scientists, the clinicians, the public health officials who are really pushing us and being pushed to the brink this year. And we also need other hands on deck, though, to navigate through this age of pandemics that we're entering. So this is why this session is so important. We need interdisciplinary perspectives, such as we've heard today, to remind us that COVID-19 is not just bad luck. It's not simply a virus that's emerged out of an accident. This pandemic is the result of many thousands of choices that we've made, many thousands of policy decisions to create and sustain a particular world order. And we've heard about some of that this hour. It's within this sort of world order that COVID-19 is existing. It's a symptom, really, of ill health in the body politic. And I think it's a clear and it couldn't be clearer, a warning that neoliberal economics is socially and environmentally unsustainable, a clarion call, as you might say. I want to thank our three speakers on that note for encouraging us to locate the pandemic within this broader perspective and beginning to think about, what alternatives might be possible. And I hope the audience will take that away. I hope plenary session 0 will be a super spreader event in that sense. Before I sign off and say farewell, the PMAC organizers have asked you to complete the session evaluation before you sign off. So the questions are: please rate this webinar session in terms of usefulness, the speakers, panelists, moderators presented or discussed the matter well. You can be as honest as you like. The webinar session was engaging and interactive. The time available for presentations and discussions was adequate. Did you have any difficulties participating in the webinar, and are you interested in participating in future webinars? So those are the questions that they're asking you to quickly select. So just get rid of that for me. But otherwise, there's another webinar coming up. I believe that you'll see the slide in a moment. And I just want to thank the three speakers again for keeping to time and to giving us a lot of food for thought, because I think this is a very challenging topic, and we need everybody on board for this. So goodbye from us, and please keep safe and well, and thank you for joining us today.